Good morning, vinyl community, crime community. I'm stuck in this chapter. I don't even know where to begin, but I'm just going to start reading. It was in the spirit of Frome and Good began their militant campaign to further the cause of the Manson was now calling ATWA, an acronym for air, trees, water, and animals. At war and all the way alive, the phrase has previously used to describe a particularly lively jam session. Long before scientists warned about the threat to the survival of life presented by global warming and pollution became common knowledge, Manson pioneered an extreme return to nature lifestyle. Manson's Atwa is not a political theory to read about or debate. It's a way of life that must be enacted in deeds rather than words, bearing many similarities to the better known Earth First, the deep ecology movement, and Europe's green political parties. Atwa's purposes that mankind blind and self-destructive greed and obsession with the money mind has led the species to the brink of self-destruction. Through the corporate despoliation of natural resources for maximum profit, Manson argued a state of ecological emergency has been brought about. If radical measures are not taken, the complete destruction of life on Earth is guaranteed. Though those who have brought about the state of catastrophe, Manson stated, are the big money benders and lenders that are selling the next generation of children out. He advocated the complete cessation of the automobile industry and its accomplice of ecocide, the oil industry, and as a necessary step. Our air is dying. We've got to stop in fossil fuel. If we don't stop that oil consumption, there's nothing left. As an alternative, Manson recommended returning to the house as a means of transportation. Manson considered the gravity of the ecological crisis so dangerous that he proposed that not only he specifically termed a one world government and a one world court whose resources are completely dedicated to the reseeding and regreening of the poisoned earth at all costs can possibly affect the necessary change. Mankind, he believed, has a spiritual obligation to become a servant to the earth rather than an exploiter of its resources. For this to happen, a new understanding of man's subordinate possession to the natural world must be reclaimed. Atwa rejects the arrogant, anthropocentric secular humanism chat that has led to this situation since the Enlightenment. Manson confronted the basic underpinnings of rational and profane liberalism with a pantheistic and pagan recognition of the holiness and interconnectedness to all of nature. He recommended adopting a vegetarian diet and actively working against experimentation on animals, the whaling industry, and all other human exploitation of the animal kingdom. Manson's belief in reincarnation and karma informed his pro-animal stance, as did his shamanistic practice of communing with totem animals. Atwa goes against the grain of the modern world by repudiating the commercialized digital mechanized robot system mankind has been enslaved by and urging a return to life deeply bound with the natural world. Frome and Good co-creates as this development ecological evangelism became soldiers of the front line of Manson's holy revolution against pollution. Most of the political extremists of left and right have been drawn to Manson, have tended to reduce his revolutionary creed to strictly rational political goals, selectively ignoring the fact that Mansonian metapolitics is indivisible with his spiritual understanding. Manson continually stressed that Atwa begins in changing thought and bringing one's own inner being into balance. Without first undertaking the work of this internal revolution, Manson maintained any attempt of external revolution would only reflect the confusion of old returns of programming that got everyone fucked up in the first place. How can you go into a new thought world if you drag in the old one with you in your mind? The Atwas is essentially a religious movement rooted in the transformation of mind, was also emphasized in Manson's statement that I won't sell my soul, for it's for Atwa. That's the only way life on earth can be alive. The will of God is life. Get in God's will or die. Die can be done in the minds without thought pattern. In the minds of thought pattern, and new life can be brought in focus. Obviously, this clear stated theistic basis of Atwa would make an anathema to those violently irreligious Satanists and other secular atheists who ignorantly claimed allegiance to Manson, but this fine point seemed to be lost in them. The religious and theocratic dimension of Manson's ecological revolution was first embodied in the Order of Rainbow, alternately known as nonness. Much has been made of the Manson family as a religious cult that it never really was. But it was actually the the Order of Rainbow that gave formed expression to Manson's political mystical vision. He was specifically described as a new religion carrying out a holy war, a phrase that carries more resonance in the post-9/11 era than it did in 1970s. Open only to women, nonness Order of the Rainbow found Manson remaining in the former Spahn-Barker-Rand circle according to a hierarchy of colors. Like the spectrums of light and thought, Fromm was rechristened as red and Sandra Good became blue. They began to be seen in the streets of Sacramento in color-coded robes they made themselves. We're waiting for our Lord, and there's only one thing to do before he comes off the cross, and that's to clean up the earth, Fromm explained, adding that her red robe was red with sacrifice, which is not what Jesus wants. He wants redemption. But we'll continue. In the early 70s, the loyalty of the imprisoned Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten was still up in the air. Manson also renamed Susan Violet Krenwinkel Yellow because her attorney, Dae Shin, was a yellow Korean, and Leslie was dubbed Green. They opted out of Rainbow, however, informing Fromm that they wanted no part of Charlie's new order. I'm grateful to Frankie Vegas, a participant in my online Manson file forum, for pointing out that the Manson's rainbow concept was almost certainly inspired by an invented foul Native American legend popular among credulous ecology-minded hippies in the early 1970s, a fictional concept of a prophecy in which Native American ecology activists known as Rainbow Warriors arrived to save the earth during a co-apocalyptic is not the authentic folk tradition it pretends to be. Rather, it was invented in 1962 by authors William Willoya and Wilson Brown in their Christian conversion tract, Warriors of the Rainbow. If this Christian hoax is indeed the source of the Order of the Rainbow, Manson wasn't the only one to be influenced by it. Greenpeace also named its signature ship Rainbow Warrior. In contrast to the frolicsome free-for-all of the days when the Spahn ranchers orgied with Hollywood's beautiful people, Manson advised the nonness live up to its name. He bade them to follow a strict code of no fornication or showing your ass and the morality of the highest on earth. Laws behind the veil as much as it was at the ranch. Outside the veil, they will obey the laws of the land. In 1985, Sandra Good explained with nearly Islamic propriety to a Newsday reporter that she kept her hair covered in a scarf for respect of modesty. It's part of our religion. We're Mansonites. We're in the house of Manson. A strict vegetarian diet, a ban on smoking, and the forbidding of makeup rounded out the rules of the nonness convent. Manson also vetoed the watching of movies and violence that set thoughts of death and confusion. For reasons unexplained, Manson, Good, and Fromm began openly speaking of themselves as the Manson family. In this period, despite having ferociously denied that they ever called themselves that previously, they later dropped this label again. Manson derived 7 imaginary degrees of this new faith, including witch, queen, a lichen, and goddess, along with accompanying ceremonial 1 degree of nonness. Wrote Red, can be gotten by sleeping in an open grave at the graveyard. No violence, only completion of old Christian fears. Sleeping in the graveyard is one of the Scottish folk religious customs practiced by the Ozark hillbilly medicine man known as the groomer doctors. It's also a spiritual method in Hindu and Buddhist Tantrism of the light hand path. The no violence edict was apparently open to interpretation. At the trial of one Edward Vanderhooft, who corresponded with Blue and Red in the early 1970s, it was alleged that they tried to persuade him to kill executives for polluting companies, specifically William Roach, the president of Kaiser Aluminum. Whether this was true or not, the letter writing campaign Fromm and Good initiated in order to intimidate corporate polluters certainly took on a more threatening tone. Executives at Dow, Atlantic Oil, Westinghouse, Remington, and Standard Oil received warnings to cease and desist from tipping the scales against the ecological balance. Around the same time, Susan Murphy, the new convert to the Order of Rainbow, was identified herself as a sister in Manson's church, gave another young man, Michael Davis, 171 threatening anti-pollution letters to mail in envelopes stolen from a Berkeley Catholic organization. Some of these actions were carried out under the name of the non-existent organization Red and Blue called the International People's Court of Retribution. Good was later prosecuted in part for calling on the following death threat to the San Francisco Chronicle, the International People's Court of Retribution, in a new justice movement for the balance of the earth. All state and federal and private money interests are now warned. Stop whaling. We consider all wildlife to be part of ourselves and will move viciously to defend our lives. Anyone caught killing wildlife, polluting, or cutting down trees will be maimed, poisoned, or chopped in a similar manner. A whaler without arms cannot swim. On August 9, 1974, exactly 5 years to the day since the Cielo Drive murders, a disgraced Richard M. Nixon was forced to resign from the presidency of the United States. Exactly 5 years to the date. The law and order candidate had been revealed to be a crook. Manson, Fromm, and Good, who never forgave Manson for prejudicing the jury against Manson with his prematurely voiced guilty verdict, considered Manson's downfall as a clear sign of karma in action. When Nixon's unelected successor, Gerald R. Ford, granted Nixon a complete pardon for any crimes he may have committed while in office, the small circle of Ottawa warriors weren't the only ones who felt that injustice had been done. Without a proper criminal trial, the full extent of Nixon's crimes would never come to light. Ford had a history of preventing Americans from learning of their government's secret skullduggery. 10 years earlier, he had been a major part of the Warren Commission charged of Lyndon Johnson by covering up the circumstances of the murder of John F. Kennedy. Red and Blue saw Ford as a continuance of the Nixon regime. In a 74 press release, Fromm wrote, "If Nixon, reality wearing a Ford face, continues to run this country against the law without any real truth, trust, or faith, if Manson is not allowed to explain what you are sheltering to face, your homes will be bloodier than the Tate LaBianca houses and the My Lai put together." If Fromm and Good made any tactical mistake in promoting their radical political program, it was repeatedly invoked in the 1969 murders, which were actually irrelevant to the Ottawa cause. Good, in particular, issued several statements attempting to reactively retouch the Tate LaBianca killings as ecological protest actions. Leaving aside the fact that this simply wasn't true, her strategy also alienated many potential supporters of Manson's Ottawa activism by unnecessarily connecting it to the crimes. In September 5th of 1975, Gerald Ford made a public appearance at a park near Sacramento's state capitol building. Very near to the apartment Fromm and Good shared, Red waited for his arrival dressed in her scarlet nunness habit, a 45 caliber Colt hidden in her hand. She managed to point the gun at Ford before tackled by an alert Secret Service agent. Fromm later claimed that she hadn't intended to shoot the president, but was merely seeking to win attention for the cause of getting Manson a new trial. The Colt was loaded, but its chambers were empty. Fromm's ultimate intention remains a mystery. The Ford episode inspired a new wave of anti-Manson panic among the masses. For many survivors of the splintering wounded, radical left voiced support for Fromm's action as a justified attack on the leader of the world imperialism and capitalism. For instance, the radical British anarchist counterculture magazine, The Fanatic, printed a nude photograph of Fromm that seemed to offer tactic support of Ford's failed assassin. At that same time, which also featured a strident speech by wanted fugitive former Charlie Chaplin and Fromm's acquaintance, Abby Hoffman, there was a selection of quotes from Adolf Hitler. This article is introduced with this observation. It may be natural to shun all contact with the philosophy whose practical results proved to be cataclysmic, or perhaps it is time to consider Hitler from an historical rather than an emotional view. Many of his observations have humor and a traditional brand of common sense, and more significantly, an echo of a style of thought which has informed the great heresies of the Christian era and which continues in many ways to challenge the modern orthodoxies. One Hitler remark selected that the Fanatic could just as easily have been uttered by Fromme, Gooden, or Manson. Orth der Führer, when the people began to cut down their trees without making any provisions for reforestation and thus rob nature's wise irrigation systems and its most essential prerequisite, you may be sure it's a sign of the beginning of the cultural disintegration. One of the features of the National Socialistic Program, overlooked by contemporary historians, was its pioneering emphasis on emotional preservation and animal rights, which preceded Europe's later Green Movement. Equally pertinent to the countercultural ethos was another Hitler quote cited in The Fanatic, commenting on Americans. They live like pigs, but in luxury sties. I have a girlfriend who's living like a pig. It's very bothersome. Preserved in the issue of an obscure radical journal as evidence of a strange 70s fusion of extreme left and extreme right revolutionary thought, which has been all but forgotten now. Although most historians of the counterculture to date have failed to take note of this phenomenon, a certain fascination for the Third Reich was already in evidence among the adherents to the dissident youth of the 60s. Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, here we go, vinyl community, this is right up your alley, was famously photographed with the Italo-German girlfriend, Anita Pallenberg, in full SS uniform. George Harrison of the Beatles was an avid collector of Nazi paraphernalia. Kenneth Anger's invocation of My Demon Brother features the visibly tripping director hoisting a swastika flag during the public magical ritual attended by Bobby Beausoleil, who acknowledged that he was influenced at the time by ultra-right-wing philosopher Francis Parker Yockey's magnum opus, Imperium. The Hells Angels and other outlaw biker gangs provoked the older generation who fought the Axis in World War II by supporting more Nazi regalia than a pansy division. Many Haight-Ashbury heads whose permanent conflict with neighboring blacks in the Fillmore district had already been mentioned was intrigued by not only historically accurate writings on the mystical underpinnings of the early National Socialist movement, Timothy Leary's essay, The Astonishing Genetic Meaning of the Nazi Hitler Experiment, recognizing Adolf Hitler as a future mutant, whose brain had been activated 5 stages ahead of his hive. Leary was now denying that the German leader was a male, macho, militaristic murderer, argued that Hitler was the most effective futant explorer the planet Earth had produced up to his confused epoch, and as much obviously played a vital and necessary role in human evolution. The same psychedelic insurgents of the 60s sense a kinship with the seemingly opposed revolution waged in Germany 30 years earlier is really not so surprising. The earlier Volksstaat movement, which was later subsumed by the National Socialist Party, was like the hippie generation, a loose link uprising and disaffected young people who sought to build a utopian alternative to what they viewed as an old degenerate ruling elite. The young Nazis of the 20s and 30s blamed all social problems on the system, in the same manner as the hippies castigized the establishment. World War I, Volchek youth in Germany formed back to nature communes and experimented with such alternative practices as ecology, nudism, vegetarianism, health food, astrology, and Eastern metaphysics long before the 60s counterculture discovered them. A scantily clad young people communing with nature and playing folk music on guitars and documentary footage of the proto-Nazi youth gathering suggests nothing less than a short-haired monochrome Woodstock before its crime. The hopeful yearnings of the 1920s radical youth of the future, the Third Reich, that would magically redeem all social life, has much in common with the 60s counterculture, equally unrealistic utopian golden age, experimenting for the coming age of Aquarius. The similarities between the two seemingly unlike revolutionary impulses would for a time become manifest in some aspects of the Atwa phenomenon, which found a balance between both extremities. The controversial work of Savitri Devi offered an interpretation of Hitlerian ecology and animal rights based on Hindu metaphysics, parallel much of Manson's Atwa philosophy. 5 days after Frommy's arrest for attempted assassination of Gerald Ford, Sandra Good began a new wave of threatening phone calls to radio stations and was arrested herself. One of her incendiary statements to the Associated Press, which led to her conviction, announced, "The International People's Court of Retribution is a wave of assassins. It's made up of several thousand people throughout the world who love the earth, the children, and their own lives. They have been silently watching executives and chairmen of the boards and their wives of companies and industries, and in any way harm the air, water, and earth and wildlife. They can be assassinated on golf courses. They've moved on to their own accord. Necessity dictates policy. Exxon, ITT, Standard Oil, Union Oil, lumber company executives, Gulf Oil must get out of the company or you will be killed. We want to live, you maggots, you monsters. Get out of the country or you'll be killed." Fromm and Good were both incarcerated in a women's penitentiary at Alderson, West Virginia. Although the Ford incident sparked new attention to the Manson cause, Fromm's entrance into the federal prison system was a major blow to Manson's Atwa movement. In the 1970s, when Fromme was Manson's main spokeswoman on the outside, her charm, sense of humor, and poetic eloquence often convinced even Manson detractors of the sincerity of her commitment to Atwa. Many journalists and even police officials who met Fromme in the 1969-79 period were impressed with her grasp of ecological matters and current events. Her example even persuaded some to see Manson in a less biased light and drop some of the more stereotyped views concerning the brainwashed Manson followers. In contrast, many of the same journalists and law enforcement personnel who spoke highly to me of Manson was alienated by Sandra Good's humorless zealotry. Good, despite her obviously intelligence and doubtless loyalty, adopted a shrill, dogmatic, and pushy demeanor. Her relentlessly preachy manner struck some as confirming the worst suspicions of strident Charlie cultism. Her 1992 statement to Esquire writer Irving Saltaroff exemplifies his tendency. Sharon Tate's baby dying, a baby would grow up to be a fat fucking hamburger-eating, earth-destroying, soul piece of shit. What Good was later paroled from prison and took on the task of serving as Manson's media liaison. Her proprietary attitude and snobbish disdain for unbelievers often turned potentially sympathetic reporters into disgruntled enemies. Good's holier than thou for Charlie's than Charlie approached and even managed to drive some of the Manson supporters away. Propaganda, as many political parties have learned, as often simply a matter of personality. In the intervening decades, one or the other individuals has made a serious effort to publicly represent Mansonian metapolitics outside of prison walls. In 1980, 28-year-old James N. Mason, attracted by the Ford assassination attempt and the Atwa eco-terrorism letter-writing scheme, initiated a correspondence with Red and Blue, writing letters, schemes. Still doing time in Alderson, Manson had a familiar link with fellow Ohioan Manson that went way back to the 1950s. When Manson was serving time in the penitentiary in Chillicothe, Ohio, Mason's father was working there as a guard. James Mason's earlier political activity took place under the aegis of George Lincoln Rockwell's American Nazi Party. He joined his youth movement in 1966, the year before Rockwell was assassinated by a rival of his own group. While the Manson Circle was in full swing in 68, the teenage Mason, who disdained drugs and had no affinity for hippies, was employed at party headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. When the American Nazi Party split into competing factions after the founder's death, Mason was eventually drawn to the more radical terrorist activism of Joseph Tomasi of the Nationalist Socialist Liberation Front. Tomasi was inspired by the violent revolutionary rhetoric of the militant left at the time and adopted the weather underground tactics of his own right-wing guerrilla aims. Tomasi's live by the sword philosophy led to his own assassination in 1975. Increasingly frustrated by the failure of the radical right to move from its insular, antiquarian, and marginal status, Manson, 1980, react with Red and Blue galvanized him. He told them about his extreme alienation from the conventional right and his desire to find some less confining way to take on the system. This encouraged them to contact Manson directly. And James Mason found a mentor he later described as a great leader, philosopher in our midst, with a name and reputation renowned and the following of his own. Loose as it may be, at least equal in number, if not greater than the combined groups combining the traditional radical right, the actions had been mightier, his ideas loftier, his eloquence greater, his philosophy superior, and his impact 10,000 times that of anything the movement can offset, and its closest runner-up, the only man who can teach or tell me anything. In the early 1973, Mason had already placed Charlie's defiant mugshot on a National Socialist Movement propaganda pamphlet with George Bernard Shaw's famous quote about Jack the Ripper. Whilst we, the conventional, were waiting time on education, agitation, and organization, some independent genius was taking the matter in hand. Shaw's statement was an ironic reference to how the unknown whittle-shaped murders, killing the prostitutes, and inadvertently opened 19th century's London eyes to the social problems of the poor. Manson was implying that the Tate LaBianca murders were a deliberate political act which had struck out against the system, basically the same error of interpretation based on misinformation we've already seen Bernardine Doran and the Weathermen making. Doran preferred to see Tex Watson's drug robberies as a terrorist action against the capitalist pigs and went along with the establishment's erroneous view that Manson was the mastermind behind the other crimes than the accessory. Manson's ideological slant, on the other hand, allowed him to imagine that the Yellow Drive killings had been carried out as what was to be called direct action against the Jewish system. Of course, Manson, like Doran before him, was not privy to the facts of the case, which led him to fill in the gaps according to his own political views. As always, the reflection of the Manson mirror held something for everyone to latch onto. In 1982, James Mason followed Manson's advice and broke with his conventional far-right commands to strike out on his own. He adapted universal order, a faith central to the Manson spiritual understanding as the name of the new movement. Manson wrote that universal order has no links whatever with conservatism of the right wing or the left. That's the matter. It largely disarms the enemy because he doesn't know what to expect or how to deal with it. It has fascination and appeal to youth. Universal order, Manson explained, is more a concept than the name of any group or organization. Universal order is opposed to some kind of localized, specialized executive order. When order is truly universal, and only then, it will be right, proper, and most of all, everlasting. Manson agreed to design the universal order symbol and was named by Mason as its central inspiration. But Mason was always careful in his writings to clarify that he wasn't speaking for Manson per se. The universal order and transcending the dualistic limitation of left and right came closer to representing something like a coherent political vision of Mansonite philosophy than anything the radical left had come up with. But for all of Manson's doubtless sincerity, there was one major flaw with this worldview. In all the writings, he implicitly and by name accepted Buglioti's helter-skelter fantasy as an accurate description of Manson's revolutionary cause. Manson's universal order fell into the same trap leftist extremists stumbled on. He wrongly assumed that the Hinman, Tate, LaBianca, and Che murders were an expression of Manson's philosophy, which they patently were not. Therefore, Manson's link with universal order are based on an interpretation of his own acts, which Manson himself otherwise adamantly refuted. The universal order's understanding of Manson, in other words, was dictated by believing helter-skelter, hook, line, and sinker, including full acceptance of the cover-up story that Manson ordered killings intended to trigger a race war. Not only wasn't this true, it's something which Manson, Fromm, and Good have all consistently denied for decades. The essence of the Universal Order revolutionary program consisted of hoping that Bugliosi's helter-skelter would come down soon. Perhaps this explains why Manson maintains a certain distance from full-out avowal of the Universal Order, once advising Manson that war is not needed, just turn TV, radio, and news, and plus televisions and lights, and it will all go away anyway. Considering all the historical talk on the mass media about supposed post-1969 Manson-inspired murders, little suspicions was paid to the November 1982 killing of 17-year-old Joseph Hoover. However, a young neo-Nazi was shot 8 times in the head by Perry Red Wartam, the leader of the local Universal Order cell. Wartam suspected Hoover of snitching to the police about the origins of the Universal Order pamphlets distributed outside the Orcaville, California elementary schools. Wartam visited Manson at least 4 times while at Vacaville and was photographed with him and his son. While in prison and awaiting trial, Wartam wrote a long article, Terrorism Explaining His Theory of Political Terrorism. This was printed in the Universal Order newsletter, Siege. When Wartam asked Manson to provide him help during his trial, Manson chose not to cooperate. The Hoover murder, although not directly related to Manson, inspired a brief but intense media frenzy which sought to create fearful impressions of the public mind of Manson and the new American Hitler, whatever it would be. The tabloid press circulated several scenario stories suggesting that Manson was the Fuhrer of the American far right. That was, to say at least, an exaggeration. Comparing anyone who supports unpopular social views to Hitler has become the modern equivalent of being branded as a witch in the Middle Ages. It's simply a tactic to block any serious inquiry of a simple emotional reflex. It's true that Manson, having X'd himself out of conventional thought, didn't accept the wholesale demonization of Hitler, which mainstream society is obliged to endorse without question. However, unknown to those who buy the Bugliosi stereotype, Manson frequently discouraged Hitler's fetishism as many right-wing ideologies, as illustrated in this statement. Adolf Hitler was just a teardrop from my eye. He was a little girl. He was called into prison a punk. He did not know how to fight, play music, sports. He could talk and show. The men of the SS made him into a power because they had to. Manson certainly continues to enjoy support from all sides of the extremist spectrum, but the universal order and Manson, contrary to legend, never commanded such a way of allegiance from traditional American far rightists who considered promiscuous sexuality, psychedelic drug use, and long hair of relics as a hippie movement. They hated. The extreme right, with exceptions, tended to view that the Mason-Manson axis was even more extreme for their own despised demographic. The squealism of something James Mason himself predicted when he wrote of his more conservative fellow travelers. They'll say what they can have anything to do with such a criminal, such a defective, such a pervert, such a monster. Ultimately, Manson's universal order didn't find its greatest acceptance among political revolutionaries. Instead, a defiant symbolism was adopted for reason or two of the incestuous world of avidly avant-garde artists and underground musicians who flirted with the atheistic and fashionable fascism of the 1990s. But that misadventure drifted far afield from anything Manson had in mind when he urged his supporters to work for Atwa. In a post-revolutionary consumer age like his own, he would appear to even most extreme political, social solutions can be defanged and absorbed into entertainment or art. Although Manson abruptly broke with the renounced Mason and the universal order of the late 80s, the lingering Mansonite influence can be traced to some of the rhetoric of the far terrorist network Atomwaffen Division. Since its 2015 inception, Atomwaffen has drawn much of the inspiration from James Mason's book Siege. For nearly 50 years, Manson predicted the downfall of the money mind and argued for a thoroughgoing reform of mankind's priorities. With the collapse of communism in 1989 and the near collapse of capitalism 20 years later, the need for a new social order has become obvious to even the most oblivious observers. Whether mankind will recognize the crucial significance ecology must play in any serious attempt to build a new order remains to be seen. In the spring of 2009, the undaunted Manson issued a communique to the Atwa Fellowship. I'm not broken, I'm not beaten. My own holy revolution against pollution is still in full swing. During his trial, illness, one of the last worldly political matters Manson concerned himself with was the controversy in the theoretically United States about the continued use by some southern states of the Confederate flag. In the July 22, 2015 statement entitled Flag of the Dead Riders, Manson wrote, "Flag is a dead rider, all the soldiers of the world who died for God and life, soldiers of man's son, S-U-N. Death Riders, Flag of the Dead has got nothing to do with race. The dead soldier has got no mind's eye on that kind of hate. The fear projected on the flag shows who's the real fear and hate. That kind of old generations show the young clear whose troubles that's projecting the real of that hate to make programs of fear control. That's what's making fear control. You can't program a dead soldier. You've got no fear. You can't die." Manson soldiers, emperor of the dead ride, on and on. Fear controls and rules of money and sex, the emperor of death and the mass wars of the past, Manson of soldiers, millions of death soldiers of the emperor of the one world Atwa have a flag now. Thank you, fear controllers. Atwa gladly accepts what's rejected and not wanted. People who know the games played by fear pushers. Dead Riders and Atwa has a fear of no air, no water. Coming into the real, when it breaks into the real, it will have its own lightning and thunder. People of color have been playing color. Air has got no color. Water and sky, blue, real. Read this with your soul forever. red, white, and blue, green, and colors of all flags all over the world, in all honor. There was no honor in disrespecting the dead emperor's flag. You have disrespected the dead with your racist games of fear play and is on the way back. That's why you did divide and conquer. That's how you destroyed the USA. It takes a long time to realize the North-South War was fought over money. King Cotton and control over the stock, land, and world. The USA was a baby of 200 or 300 years old. A baby, other countries were 1,500 to 5,000 years old. USA is still red, white, and blue. A red, white, and blue child. The North and South wars have been reflecting around the world. No war has ever ended. I command all the wars as my dead riders forever. Emperor of Death, Charles Manson, 2015. We're just going to end here now. These are more sayings from Charlie Manson, which I find extremely enlightening. There's more information in this book than I can even deal with at this time. They're going to talk about all the shows that my father, Don McElwain, cast, who apparently put me on Spawn Ranch from Columbo to Mission Impossible to Charlie's Angels. It's just on and on and on. Universal Studios to Spawn Ranch, right to here. And Steve was supposed to be in Charlie's band. God bless the vinyl community and all the people, and God bless the children.